supporters are having against the DNC?
Yes.
All right. So the DNC has literally admitted, yeah, we cheated. Right? But what's their argument?
It's not
We're allowed to. What are you doing in state court or a private organization? To be honest, I think they're going to win that argument. It's the same argument that's been made a long time. What people don't understand, my Democratic friends don't like this. They say, yeah, it's the same argument you made in 1944 when you said African Americans couldn't vote in the Democratic primary. Exact same argument.
The fact that it's publicly funded, does that not change it?
That argument, so, I mean, we could get into the legal constructs, but that's a lot of people say, well, why don't you fight the legal argument on the fact that public funds are paying for the private purpose? Well, in the Constitution, you have fundamental rights, right? You have the right to associate with somebody, right? You have the right to speech, right? You have the right to bear arms. I don't want to get into that debate right now. Something like, can the state fund a private activity, doesn't fall in the realm of these like overarching fundamental rights. So really, it's up legislatures can determine with wide latitude what constitutes a public purpose. So governments fund private entities all the time, but the justification is that by funding this, it's serving the public, right? So there's a legitimate argument to say, you know, if we didn't fund these private primaries, well then they'd meet at Elijah's and sit around and have some beers and decide who's going to win. So there's a benefit. Right?
Well, they're doing it anyway.
That's a legitimate counter argument. Right. So, I mean, if you follow the legal arguments down the chain, essentially where the courts have gone, the courts, I think, rightfully don't want to get into the political discussion, right? They want to adjudicate law, so they're very hesitant to get into political discussions. So essentially where the courts are in almost every state is if the legislature made a law and said that it serves a public purpose, well, they were elected by the public, and so we're not going to second guess it, right? That's essentially where it is. So, yeah.
Because most institutions that get public funding, they have strings attached. And it would seem to me that if you were to say there's a primary and we have a selection, and that it is publicly stated that this is a fair and impartial election, then that's false advertising, or I don't know how you would want to say it, but it would seem that that in itself, since it's not selling what it's saying it's selling, and it's being publicly funded, that we should be able to, you know.
I really think you have to get on the opposite side of the argument or argue. I think that's why, like focusing on this case, I think that's why you found that the attorneys in support of people challenging the DNC have relied on a lot of tortious conduct arguments, right? That goes back to my point is constitutional rights have a much higher barrier, right? But they're suing the DNC on when I say tortious conduct claims, it's like misrepresentation. They're things that usually you sue a corporation for, right? I ordered a cheeseburger that looked like this, and you gave me one that made me sick, right? So that's the type of claims they're relying on, right? So this.
But based on what you just said, that usually public funding is provided from private institutions on the basis that it serves a public purpose. The fact that the public noticeably overwhelmingly voted for Bernie and then they went with Hillary anyway and they admitted it and all that stuff, wouldn't that right there be like, but you got public money and you literally spit in the face of the public, so all that funding was for nothing, was using your own private thing with all this public funding.
Yeah, so the short answer is I'm sympathetic to that argument. I actually agree with the argument, but I think the legal constructs that we have, that it's not, the difficulty of that concept is that the courts themselves, like the courts want to stay out of that, and the status of the law that they have to adjudicate from says that we're not going to second guess the legislature, because if they make a decision on this case, that's a case that relates to what legislatures giving out money to private organizations generally, right? So judges have to think about their decisions and the consequences, not of that decision just on one case, but on everybody citing to that opinion on something else, right? So what I guess the point that I pull back to, right, is do we want to fight the fight and win that, okay, the Democratic Party misrepresented this election, that they were going to follow the rules and they didn't, okay? What's the victory? I'm not saying it's not a good victory, but what's the victory? And what's the remedy? We're not going to go back and change anything. Isn't the right at stake more fundamental, right? There's a right that precedes what the Democratic Party did. What was the fact that the Democratic Party could do that in the first place was because not only them, the Republican Party had together colluded over the period of 120 years to create a system where the only meaningful opportunity to change anything was to sneak yourself into one of the two parties, pretend like you were one of them, and cause an insurgence to change it, right? I believe that if we had a competitive playing field from the onset, Bernie Sanders wouldn't have to pretend to be a Democrat to run in the Democratic Party, right? Donald Trump wouldn't have to pretend to be a Republican to run in the Republican Party. The fact that they were the two most, populist, attractive candidates to a substantial majority of people, I think it's a testament that the problem with our election system is the two vehicles that have traditionally been the mechanisms for change aren't doing their job, right? And they need to have some kind of competition in order to force them to get back on the right road. So, relating all of that back to the top two, right? If you were going to go in the top two and you had a problem with California's primary before 2010, you'd end up in the court system saying the Democrats broke the rules and the Republicans broke the rules. And the courts are going to say, okay, well, if McDonald's breaks their corporate bylaws and the people, obviously there are times people will go to the court, but like, you generally don't run to the court to protect your rights to vote and those kinds of things in a shareholder seat, right? What we did now is because that primary serves the public, one, everybody gets to participate. But now, if your fundamental right is violated by any rule that is created, the courts have the jurisdiction to say this is a fundamental right, and the state has an obligation, a high obligation, to do everything it can to protect your right to participate in it. So, I don't know, does that invite any other questions? Yeah.
Is it a matter of waiting for this court case to come along, or do you have a method of challenging something on the books already?
For
What you just suggested.
That's a good question. So we haven't really discussed all this stuff too publicly, but what I'll put out there, what we have publicly talked about is, does anybody know what California's primary is? Like, we have closed primary, semi-closed primary. Does anybody know how California's primary was conducted at the presidential level? Right. So we talked about the state being
Semi-open, semi-closed, I guess.
The last party, if it's the Republican Party, it's closed. If it's Democratic, it's semi.
at the end of the day, it's confusing. Right? So the first question is why
It
is
means
it
if
confusing?
you're part of the
right?
Democratic Party or
Shouldn't it
independent,
be
you
one
can
simple
vote for
or two?
Democrat or
Every
independent,
voter's
but
treated the
for the
same. Why would
Republican
it be so
candidates, you
confusing?
can only vote for the Republican.
California's primary and the Secretary of State's website says semi-closed primary. Does anybody know what this California Constitution says?
Open, it says open.
It says the legislature shall conduct an open presidential primary. So why don't they do it? There's some folks, including election reformers, that are respected in a number of circles that say, well, at the time California adopted the open presidential primary, that really referred to the access of a candidate, right? It was saying candidates have open access to. I say, okay. Let's pretend that California has a different definition than all other 49 states and the Oxford Dictionary. Right? Let's take that for granted. When's the last time you've seen an independent candidate on the California presidential primary? Right? Wouldn't you have to have a place for independents and therefore a place for nonpartisan voters to participate? So, to your question, is there a legal challenge? maybe we start there, I don't know, but like, we have to, this stuff takes money, takes awareness.
But there was a court case where you at least, or at least it got into some vein of saying that, they had to argue saying open meant for the candidate, so that's actually where it sort of.
So this argument that I was just talking about has happened amongst third-party election reformers and this kind of stuff. So I'm giving you the counter argument. You know, I've gone and made the argument for operating open and semi-closed, and it says open. And there's, you know, people I'm saying there's some legitimacy in the argument that the ballot statements did, you know, refer to the access of candidates. It's a legitimate argument. I'm giving you what I think is a more legitimate counter argument than if that were the case, we would have independents and we have a place for independent voters to nominate somebody else other than a Republican or a Democrat. So
I have a question.
Yeah.
So what would be easier? Would it be easier to challenge the current closed, semi-closed primaries with a lawsuit and say, look, the California Constitution says open, clearly it's not open, or would it be easier to just put it on a ballot and put it on a ballot for public to vote? Do you want these to be open so everybody can vote? And
So-
what would be an easier or faster way to get there? Yeah.
well, there's a number of different perspectives you can interpret. Is that easier or harder, right? Would it be easier to get on the California ballot costs a lot of money in a lot of cities. So getting money to be funding something that's truly of a nonpartisan nature is hard. So that's a more difficult thing. In terms of the voters, I think, especially after 2016, once you got it on the ballot, I think it'd be easier than ever to actually get it passed.
Would it be also easier than ever to get it funded? Because it's also hard to fund a court case, isn't it?
You're gonna have to fund it with small dollar, and the folks in this room, I think, have a broader understanding than the electorate when it's 2017. You know, no elections are going on. You'd be surprised how much it's really hard to get people. Think about it. I don't blame people for being disengaged from politics, frankly. A lot of people in the political circles like try to shame voters, and how dare they don't pay attention, blah blah blah. They must be stupid. Like, I think I'm stupid because I'm still paying attention. It's ridiculous, right? Like, you're not even talking about anything, so why would you waste your time? So,
I have a question. Now, I've noticed that the Democrats are really pushing the 2018 election to make sure that we could take back, you know, the House and the Senate and all that stuff. And they're saying, so, you know, let's get the Democrats back in there. How likely is it that before those elections to come up that we could get just an independent party to be part of that as well?
well, I think I can address that surely and go back to finishing your answer too. I think it's extraordinarily hard. The obstacles to creating a new party, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party have been fighting enormous ballot hurdles. They should be applauded for it. They're tough. Takes a ton of money. People around. When Gary Johnson got ballot access in all 50 states, the average person would be like, okay, there's another. They have no idea the difficulty in the millions of dollars it took. Every single penny he raised. I mean, the Democratic and Republican primaries were over. They already knew who their candidate was, and he was still raising money so that he could get signatures to give them to the Secretary of State, just so the Libertarian Party could have a candidate on the ballot. Right? So that just demonstrates the level of hurdles for third parties. So I also think there's another problem. Is, okay, you create another third party. That's just another ideological faction. Is that really what we're trying to create? A battle amongst more ideological factions. Okay? The issue on the open primary stuff, though, too, is say you passed an open primary, and we passed it. It's still partisan in nature, remember? So it still serves the Republican and Democratic Party, and nothing else changes, but the parties are forced to allow non-members in. What's the problem? Anybody know what the problem is?
Money? To get the name out?
No?
Well, if you're talking about, the other side can vote for the worst, you're going to on the other side.
That's an argument. That's an argument they use to defend their private right. In 2000, the reason we landed on the top two nonpartisan primary In the year 2000, California had what was called a blanket open primary. It was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because they said you can't force, just like we have a right, private rights of association, non-association, they said the Republican and the Democratic parties have a right not to associate with people that they don't agree with. Right? So essentially they invalidated the term blanket. It's, you know, we can get into all the weeds and stuff, but it was basically a ballot that the voter could choose: Democrat race, Republican race, Democrat race, and choose. But it was open. Right now, open primaries are under constitutional attack all over the country. And if I were to give my long-term prediction, open primaries will ultimately be defeated by the parties altogether.
What was that?
That if I were to predict it, purely traditional open primaries will be defeated by the parties altogether across the country, because that ruling is ingrained in the Supreme Court. It's precedent established right here in California Democratic Party v. Jones says that opening up a private primary to non-members violates the First Amendment's right of non-association.
I think that they already deal with.
So right now, this goes to show the bipartisan nature of this. In Montana, the Republican Party, mind you, this is the ruling party of Montana. So think about what their actual interests are. Wants to shut down open primaries in Montana. The Democratic Party in Hawaii wants to close the primaries in Hawaii. Hawaii is substantially controlled by the Democratic Party. They actually just had their certification, denied by the Supreme Court last week. So the parties together wanted the Supreme Court to review their challenges, hoping that the Supreme Court would make that ruling. Yeah.
I have a question. Now, we all know that big money is what's behind the two major parties. Should there be a limit to what they can raise or, be?
And not according to Citizens United.
Pardon?
Not according to Citizens United. Sky's the limit.
Yeah, so it's like, shouldn't there be is there a way we can put something to stop to that? Because I think both Democrats and Republicans nowadays are they got Wall Street in their back pockets. They've got, all these the Koch brothers and all these guys, and they both do it. And they both point fingers at each other and say, no, but we know that that's not true. Isn't there a way we can stop, make a limit on how much they can raise? Because I thought there was one already. I thought there was a limit from each individual person, or you could only get so much per person. But that doesn't seem like that's what's happening to me. It seems like they're getting backdoor money somehow or something. And
Well, I can address the money policy, maybe the board of IVP. By the way, we should have recognized Jeff Marcy, the co-chair, co-founder of the Independent Voter Project, former assembly member of the California legislature. And thank you, Wellen.
Yeah.
Has done a lot of very good work. So I'm sorry for getting out of the electoral. You did a great job.
and I forgot you don't even get to eat.
The issue of money in politics is hard. One, because I don't think any of us should rationally believe that money will just suddenly leave politics, right? So the question is, how do we design the incentives so that the money is the most transparent and that we can have. There's various viewpoints. Most of the time we talk about things like public financing, or we talk about lowering limits, and those have come kind of grown up on mostly the left side of the ideological spectrum. There are very good nonpartisan organizations out there that I recommend that are really looking at this issue. Represent Us is one of them. Take Back the Republic kind of approaches it from a more traditionally conservative perspective, but they are nonpartisan organizations who, really think this is a critical issue, as do I. I think it's a really tough issue because it goes back to the fundamental rights situation, right? Citizens United has held that it's a right of free speech, right? And we can debate the merits of that. But I would argue, every time you decrease the limits, direct donations to a candidate, what's the unintended consequence of decreasing the donation to candidates, right? You have to have money to run a campaign, especially this day and age. The unintended consequences, now the legislator, instead of legislating, has to sit on the phone, call more people all this year, and then has to find some big money people to find their way into a PAC to do all the things that they can't do by virtue. So I think there's a legitimate argument that we should actually be going the other direction. There are proposals.
Only public funding, and.
And what about lobbyists? Why are there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, we could debate the merits of this. Like I said, this isn't the space I really live in, but there'd be some people that would react to that and say, okay, well, if you had only public funding, you don't get over the Citizens United problem.
Got to get rid of Citizens United and Buckley, complete the layout.
Buckley versus, that's the case that people really should be talking about, right? And nobody does. It's a very difficult conversation, and I don't have the answers. But, yeah.
What exactly is a super PAC? I was always curious about that when they talk about that, and it's like, it's kind of confused me.
It's essentially just it's a committee, it's a corporate filing, so it's a corporation established for the purpose of involving itself in political activity.
Shouldn't that be illegal?
Yeah.
Well, that's Citizens
From
United
the
said, no,
citizens.
it's not. So that's what they say.
Who the heck are these Citizens United people I keep hearing about anyway?
He's making this point earlier, and it's really hard to grasp, but they're not, the Democrats and the Republican parties are treated as membership clubs, pretty much,
Like a country club.
as under the law. So just to give you a sense of it, so when like he was mentioning them suing the Democratic National Chair or Committee
Yeah.
for Bernie Sanders for the misrepresentation, you're like, well, they're misrepresented, how can they get away with that? Well, because they kind of snuck in, they carry all these corporate interests in, but then they're like, oh, we're just a club, like we're like a Rotary or we're the Lions, so if we break our rules, that's as much as a court has to say about it. Is that kind
No,
of fair?
that's exactly the situation. We think of them, and actually at one time the court did really adjudicate them more as quasi-public entities. But it goes back to the long-term fight, right? When you're going into a courtroom, there's two stakeholders. There's the one asserting their right and the one defending themselves, right? So the political power has always been the political parties and the state, right? So it's the political party saying we violated our party right, and the state defending what they did that the party's making a claim. So over time, the parties have litigated and successfully defended the rights that insulate themselves, right? Well, who never has a voice in the courtroom, right? If you're talking about ballot access issues and it's a party litigating against a state, the individual.
Okay, couldn't we argue then that this is just a membership club? Why are we spending all of this time and energy and money publicly chastising the Russians, which is another nonsense, for hacking the elections and affecting American democracy? Because if they're not a governmental organization, then that's up to them to figure out and defend and hire their own attorneys and deal with their own situation, just like Coca-Cola or anybody else. We wouldn't have this whole hullabaloo.
Well, we run the risk of having this discussion of getting into the nasty, but I think they're ironically making the argument that we made in New Jersey when we sued them over closed primaries, is that the DNC and its operations are an integral part of our public election process, and so when anybody gets involved in anything, right? Ironically, it's the same thing we're arguing. This primary election, these private organizations choosing their nominees is so integrated with our public process that we ought to treat it from the court system as having the same constitutional protections as everything else, right? I never really thought
But
of
then
that.
they would have other strings attached than a normal organization. You know, I mean, it's one or the other. You're right. You're right.
So it goes back to my question about the stakeholders, right? Nobody's going into court saying, you said this, you defended this, and then challenging them on the consequence of that argument, right? I would say that the case we filed in New Jersey, the case that leveled the playing field, and we filed an amicus brief on the Commission on Presidential Debates, is the beginning of forcing them to confront the legal consequences of the arguments they made that they've been making over 100 years. Right?
If somebody steals a recipe from Coca-Cola, I guarantee you that the taxpayers are not gonna fight their lawsuit.
Right.
So why are we defending DNC and paying for their bills? We shouldn't be. If they're private, then we shouldn't have to pay for anything.
He's sort of indicating that they argued effectively with the state through enough court cases over these 100 years, little by little. But to say that even though they're private, they're so important in how we conduct government and everything in our society that now on the books, they're like, you can't do without us. You can't. Does that make sense? Like, we're so important we get special treatment.
The argument makes sense, but then they
But
should,
it's kind of
but then
like-
again, there are strings attached.
We're trying to get strings attached, right? We're trying to reattach the strings because they detach them.
Right.
So we're like trying to get them back. They're like,
And that's the difficulty of the space. It's very nuanced. There's like these large legal principles, which, right, I think they're private organizations, the public process, and you have all these nuances in between, but they're so intertwined with each other, right? And the stakeholders, though, that have the resources to say, defend what the outcome should be, have been the political party. My argument in the New Jersey is to say, okay, here's the irony. Here's our lawsuit in the big picture. We said the primary election is an integral stage of the public election process. The parties, remember California Democratic v. Jones, have said you cannot violate the right of association by forcing us to associate with non-members. So we went into New Jersey and said, well, if parties have a fundamental right, surely individuals do. So how can you make me give up my right to not associate with a political party in order to participate at an integral stage of the election process?
Yeah.
Right?
Couldn't you also argue that because these parties are being pitted to fulfill a public service, that they should be held in accountability for the public they're representing? So it's easy if you're in a country club to say, I don't want this type of people in here. It's a country club. It's doing nothing it's doing nothing for the public except hanging out with a bunch of like-minded people.
It's like discrimination.
But for a party that's fulfilling or that's aiming at fulfilling positions that serve a public purpose, then why do they have the right to disassociate themselves from the public they're supposed to be representing?
So what your argument you're making is a legitimate one. And we can't look at political parties either as like homogenous, like they always agree with each other, right? There was a time that there's people within the Democratic and Republican Party that like the nonpartisan primary. They support open primaries. They're not all in one. But that argument was debated and argued in court over time, right? And there was a time in the court system where they made those arguments. They said, well, no, they have to be responsive because they're public. Over time, the leadership and the people who used the attorneys and the arguments they wanted to make, the status we are at today is that the parties, because of the outcomes they wanted, got to the place where they were forced to argue were purely private organizations, and they wouldn't accept that. And the court ruled, okay, you're private organizations, right? So that's kind of where we're stuck today, is saying, yeah, okay, we understand you serve a public purpose and all that stuff, but the court has said, well, no, you're arguing in front of me, you're the ones in the courtroom, you're representing the parties, and you're telling me you want to be a private organization, okay. Well then, these are the rights that attach to it. So the question is, okay, should they serve that? How do they face the consequences, going back to you? Okay, so you say, okay, if that's the argument you're going to make, and you're going to come to the year 2000 and say voters in the state of California don't have the right to have an open blanket primary, and they still have to, give their money to fund your private elections, okay, what do we do to go back into the courtroom and say, all right, let's confront them with the consequences of that, right? So I think that's gets forwarded. Yeah, go ahead.
Are we legally required to have a primary? Why couldn't we go to something like ranked choice voting or approval voting and do away with the primary?
There's no legal requirement to have a primary. Anything that, so one of the things about the legal constructs from the federal level about election systems is that states are given extraordinarily wide latitude, right? It's both a benefit and a curse. On the one hand, it allows states to explore and create systems that are different. State by state, people are different. On the other hand, it creates confusion because you can't create a universal, national awareness of how the process works. States like Maine just passed a ranked choice voting bill. Okay, they still have a primary, but I think that's a good step in the direction of exploring a new system. Right? There's ranked choice voting, there's approval voting, there's score voting. There's all kinds of different ways, and I agree. Let's explore them. Right? But in order to get to the place where we can start exploring them, you have to understand we're fighting against two institutionalized forces that don't want to change anything.
And I really can't remember exactly how long ago I saw this, but I know it was before this last election. I just got me more involved. I remember watching something on TV, and I want to say it was Britain, that their electoral process only lasts about 2 weeks. Campaigning, it's like, why don't we pass? Because I understand that Trump's already got another commercial, or ready for 2020 for him to be reelected. It's like, it's insane. Why can't we stop that and say, look, you know what? Nobody can do anything, and of course, there's going to always be the back door slipping under the whatever happening. But as far as them going out and starting the campaign when last election just barely finished, shouldn't there be I like the idea that Britain is got 2 weeks and you gotta figure out this person, what they're saying and all that stuff. It seems to me like it's simpler, it's more compact, and no, it's, was it me again? Oh, I'm sorry.
So I think we have a massive problem. There's all kinds of potential remedies, right? One of the things I'm trying to do is bring folks together that have all the remedies to recognize the things that the commonalities amongst everybody, people that advocate ranked choice, the top two, with shortening the campaign period, reducing this, and saying, look, at the end of the day, we're all just trying to say, how can we create a more fair system, right? There's a lot of complexities that come up with every potential remedy. Can you legally do it, right? In America, they have the same fundamental rights protections in the UK as they do in the United States, right? What do you think Citizens United would say about telling you the period of time that you can campaign, right? We have to deal with the legal constructs and the constitutions and everything that we have, right? I think we've come to a place where I think whether you've realized the unfairness because you tried to participate in electing Bernie Sanders, or you realize the unfairness because 8 years ago you were a Ron Paul supporter and you saw how the Republican Party treated him, or whether you're just somebody looking at it all and saying this is ridiculous, why is it all set up like this? I think what's common, regardless of the ideologies that we can and the remedies that we have, is there's just some fundamental unfairness going on.
So tonight, as far as what we've all gathered here for, what is your message to us, basically, that you're trying to get across to us? What is it you want us to know?
I think one of the things, what our organization's really primary goal is to educate voters about the process itself, so that when we say we know there's a lot of frustration out there, we don't have all the perfect remedy or the answers. I think step one, before we can create the awareness that will make it safe for the courts to rule in a direction, will make it important for the media to report on, is that we need to start educating and say, okay, you're following this lawsuit against the DNC. Well, there's a larger, here's how it actually works. Or hey, you want to get involved in an election issue here, or you're frustrated with the process. There's some people who will never want to really understand it all. They're never going to become activists. They're never going to but when they come to the dinner table and you just have the explanation, say, hey, here's some like broad things. Like, did you know that parties are considered private corporations by the courts? And so, you know, go ahead.
What are our options? Where do we go from here? If the courts are ruling against us, what do we do?
I think we
Another
need to,
separate application.
so we need to put on the pressure in places. Independent Voter Project authored Measure K as we think a very small step in this broad thing we need to do. Signpost a legal issue that perhaps us and some other organizations might pursue. But I think staying involved with each other, we certainly hope that you continue to participate in our discussions, invite more friends to come, but creating that awareness that if, okay, can we come back to the room with 50 people and say, okay, well, 2018 is coming up. Maybe us together can figure out something good to put on the ballot.
So
Maybe
te-
us, go ahead.
So technically, I mean, even though there's an independent party and a Freedom and Peace and a Green Party and all that stuff, they're really not real, in a sense. I mean, because they don't get the opportunity to get to the general election.
The point I didn't hear it quickly.
I was saying that because of like independence and peace and freedom and the Green Parties and all that stuff, they seem never to make it to the general election. And when you get there, it's always like that Republican. And so it's like our goal, or is our goal is to get us to be able to get at that point. Is that what this is basically what you were working
Well,
for?
I think we have to view it as, I think our goal precedes that, right? Is that our goal is to see, one, get people to recognize that the rules aren't fair. Like, there's different rules if you're a member of one of the major parties. Here at Canada, the first thing we need to do is make the rules fair for everybody.
And how do we do
And
that?
then we can debate about the merits of everything else.
I've been getting notices from two different sources. One from, what's his last name? John. Yeah, from Georgia. Black guy who led the marches and got injured in summer.
John Lewis.
John Lewis, and I can't think of the other guy's name either. You help me with that? No. Rob Feinberg. They are both advocating for a national right to vote. They both are supporting a bill in Congress to actually create what we don't actually have. And almost none of us realize that we don't have a national right to vote in this country.
So, I guess
So how does that affect what we've been talking about?
national, like, constitutional fundamental right to vote, just to ingrain in our Constitution. It's not, when they say actually the right to vote, it's not in the Constitution. Right? There's two ways to have the constitutional right: to be expressed in the Constitution or to be adjudicated by the Supreme Court. Right? We can go back all the way to cases in the 1800s. If there's one right that the Supreme Court literally said the right to vote is the fundamental right that secures all others. Right? So I would argue that our courts have made it clear. Putting it into the Constitution is good. I'm not certainly wouldn't object to it and support it, but it's already there. The courts recognize that the fundamental right is actually, even though it's not codified as a fundamental right to vote. Does anybody have any guess on how they voted, how the court, the Third Circuit, ruled in New Jersey?
No.
And I promise it will address your question.
Good.
The court in New Jersey ruled against us because they said, yeah, you have the fundamental right. Yes, the primary is an integral stage of the election process. However, literally, you don't get that fundamental right in New Jersey because they've qualified it until you join a major political party.
Precisely.
My point is, even if it was codified as a fundamental right, you have to. I think it's an absurd. That's my argument. Say it again. Right. Which might. So it goes back to your question, right? It goes back to your question.
He's saying, let's just bypass all these individual states and just get a United States ruling that everyone has a right to vote.
Right.
But you just said it's already there.
my point is it's already there, and back to your question, what do we do now, right?
Yeah.
The court ruled that way, I don't think necessarily
If
because
it's
the court,
already there nationwide, then
Yeah.
why are we quibbling in each state?
because courts are responsive to the public, the press is responsive to the public, the conditions have to be right. Courts are conservative by nature because they have to make sure people are ready for it. If they ruled on us 6 months before elections were about to start in 2018 and said, closed primaries are unconstitutional, you would be left with 17 states with chaos, right? We have to create the public awareness of the issue in the courts, in the public, in the press. The reason the Supreme Court, I hope and I believe, didn't take the party's case on the open primaries because they knew as the issue coming to the court by itself wasn't right. They didn't want to go and rule that open primaries are unconstitutional, even though they feel like they're registered.
Seriously though, but their job isn't to decide when the time is right, just whether it's.
No, their job is, that's part of the job.
But that's like, but that's like saying that it's justifiable that women were able to vote until 1920 because the time wasn't right. Like,
Well, it's as if, obviously, those of us who believe that the right to vote derives from citizenship, right, you shouldn't have any conditions on it, right? There's practical considerations in getting rid of open primaries altogether and closed primaries together that go beyond the chaos, the party turmoil, that politics is sensitive to the courts and they don't want to involve themselves for a reason.
What reason?
Okay.
Because they don't want to politicize themselves, right? Remember, at the end of the day, most federal judges are appointed by the president, they're appointed by representatives and governors and stuff, right? There's a connection.
They work for us.
I agree.
They work for us.
So as we try and get you're trying to say we need to garner public opinion, like we do to try and get black people to vote or get women to vote. We need to get public opinion and get them all to be on board with the open primaries in all states.
What?
I mean, is that the only way? Because we can't just take it to the United States District Court and.
Well, I think it's both, right? And I think we need to elevate how much we understand about this. So not just do we want open primaries, do we recognize that there's a legal argument that can be used against open
I
primaries?
think after this election, I'd go out on a limb and say every state in this country wants an open primary.
Especially what happened down in the South when they started taking lawn places away and made it difficult for poor people.
People's parties registration were changed suddenly.
I think
we needed hours all the
it should be
time.
generalized throughout the whole country, the way we vote. Everybody should have an opportunity to vote by mail. If you're an American citizen, you should be able to vote by mail, which is what I do if I'm a visa. And I didn't know until I came to a meeting.
Same day registration?
Yeah, I mean, it's like registration when you're born. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah. But I mean, it's like, how do we stop this kind of stuff? What can we as individuals begin to do?
So like I said, I hope we get together. I think maybe we start, why don't we get together and start a lawsuit or something in California?
I was
Encourage people, right?
Can we challenge the Supreme Court's decision in 2000? I think it was the Democratic Party.
Democratic Party, Jones, yeah.
Yeah, can we challenge that? I know it was a unanimous decision, but can we, the people, challenge that?
I think a lot of times, I think this is also true of the Citizen United case, that opens the whole new Pandora's box, I know, is that our reaction, right, is to challenge it, and there's a lot of merit to wanting to challenge it. The practical hurdles are small, but there's also a reason the court voted unanimously. I think the way we challenge it is by confronting the opposite side of the issue, right, and put the court in the position where, say, if open primaries are unconstitutional, well then closed primaries must be unconstitutional too because of what you said about open primaries, right? That puts us in the position to say, okay, well, if open and closed are wrong, well, then maybe we need ranked choice voting, maybe we need score voting, maybe we need nonpartisan primaries, right? So I think you can embed the remedies in challenging a system, not necessarily overturning it, but bringing the consequences of it. And I think that's where we're at today is, okay, can we get together, have that conversation, and say, okay, let's strategize with the conditions that exist, and how do we do a lawsuit, do an initiative, do an education program that results in an outcome that advances the ball a little bit.
Now, are you familiar with the Open Power Electoral Reform 12-Point Act?
No.
Okay, because it's another election reform group. And I think, I'll just quickly explain this. Universal registration, free and equal ballot access, tightly drawn districts, free and equal public funding, free and equal media access, inclusive debates, open primaries, election day holiday, paper ballots, end winner takes all, legislative process integrity, and then end superdelegates. There are a couple different things here. I'm looking at this.
I thought you were gonna ask me to use support.
If you were to poll Americans,
Yeah.
okay,
No one would be against it, just.
I'd say at least 80% of Americans would say, yes, of course, right?
Politicians would be against it.
It shouldn't. So, like, if there are a lot of people working on election reform, I think. They're like a little group here and a little group here. Is there some way, and if it's your group, I think it's not wonderful, if we can centralize we have to join forces, just like we have to join forces with other parties, political
Yeah.
parties. If we intend to get anywhere, we can't say we're leftists or rightists, or we have to say, the only way we're ever going to beat the monster is if we all join together to
I agree.
accomplish
I
this.
totally agree.
Do you-
100%.
Do you think the electoral college is necessary?
Wanna go all night? I think it's just like anything, there's like really complex issues related to it. We have this simplified discussion, get rid of it or keep it, right? We can go in all day, all night, well, how come you never think about why do we give all our electors to one party with a loyalty in the first place, right? So it's very complex, there's merits on both sides, but those are the things that